welcome back to the Discover Fort Smith podcast, where we talk to people in Fort Smith about what they're doing in the area. Today's going to be an excellent conversation. Now, normally with me, I have Emily Horn from the CVB, but today,
you're stuck with me.
Today we get the incredible Ashley.
Oh my gosh, that's
Backer.
a little much.
And you were a guest on, I think, episode 2.
Yeah.
So other side of the table, it's going to be completely different. I love this. So, but today with us we have Caroline Speir. What'd you say?
The hot seat.
Oh yeah, that's not the hot seat. This is don't let her make this.
Let's mess fun, right? Sometimes, yeah.
Today we're here with Caroline Speir, who's the executive director of the Fort Smith Museum of History. So thank you for being on today's episode.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me.
So tell us about the Museum of History. How long has it been in the area, and when did you hop on board here?
So that's my favorite question, is how long has it been here?
Yeah.
So that is one of my favorite questions, because the museum has actually been here since 1910.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
in this building?
No, it's been in this building since 1979.
Okay.
So in 1910, the commissary building to the first fort, or second fort technically.
Which is National Historic Site, right?
Correct.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
So, no. So the commissary building, what we call the second fort, was built in the 1830s. So the first fort, and this is a distinction that probably only us in the field really distinguish between being the first and the second. But the first fort was built at Bell Point, which is on the knoll over there, and the remains are in the ground. So that's what would have looked out over the rivers. So that one was closed in 1824, sent upriver, and then in the 1830s, actually John Rogers, who founded Fort Smith, the town, there was a letter writing campaign that he got the citizens involved with to bring back the military.
Oh, cool.
Because once they left, of course, there was no authority really here. And the police department didn't come in. I think it's the 1888 is when it's founded. But they wanted the military presence back. It was also a great business opportunity for him. So he owned all that land.
Oh, okay.
And so the letter writing campaign was launched with the support of the citizens to D.C., asking and encouraging for the military to come back, which they did. And so then he was able to sell the land that the historic site is now on to the federal government. Okay. So there was that part of it too. But so in the 1830s, what we know today is the historic site is when that was built.
Okay.
So the brick buildings that you see out there, there was more to it. It was larger than that. But the commissary building was built in the 1830s. That building, of course, was the commissary to the second fort. Over the years, it was a chambers for Judge Parker. It was a private residence. It was a hospital. It was, I think, a temporary jail at one time. It was also the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War. So at the turn of the century, it had fallen into disrepair. So Parker was here from 1875 to 1895. And then in that span of time that it's not for federal use anymore, and even when he's here, it's not part of an active military fort. So it's not being looked after the same way that it had been. So the building is falling into disrepair, and they had already lost the quartermaster building. So the quartermaster building was a mirror to the commissary building, which sat today, when you cross the railroad tracks, it sat right on that little knoll. They had already lost that building. In fact, I think when it came down, they actually kind of pushed it into the river. So it was just gone. But they didn't want to lose the commissary building. It was such a historic building. And so there were a group of ladies who got together and approached the city and said, please help us do this. And the city said, that sounds like a grand idea. And so they formed this partnership and were able to save the commissary building. So that's actually where this museum started, is in the commissary building, and was called the Old Commissary Museum.
Nice.
They didn't deviate from the name. So these ladies were, they started collecting Fort Smith history at that time. It's 1907. So you're looking at 20, 30 years prior to that. So we've, Civil War era, give or take. And then it's over there until the 60s. It actually, it was in the museum occupied that building almost as long as what it was used for anything else. And then again, whenever, so across the nation after World War II, there's this push to establish, especially in the 60s, or what would become the 60s anyway, national parks. And so in order for our park to become a national park, one of the caveats was that the commissary revert back to federal ownership. And so again, the museum and the city worked together to make that happen. And so in 79, the museum moved to this building. And over that time, it had changed names to the old Fort Museum. So a lot of people, if you've been in town very long or grew up here, you knew it as the old Fort Museum. So 79, they move here. And then in 99, the name is changed to the Fort Smith Museum of History. But this building is a 1906. So it's on the National Register. So it's our biggest artifact. We've got 40,000 plus artifacts in the collection, but the building is the biggest one. Wow. It was built as a hardware store. That's what this building started out as. Yeah. It was a family business. And it's great to think of it because the family business had started over on Garrison Avenue, and they had been here since 1854, kind of in a shotgun building. They were over on about where Regions just moved from, that area.
Yeah.
And they merged with a little hardware store in Van Buren, and they called it Atkinson Williams Hardware.
Okay.
And then in the 30s, it became Williams Hardware. I think that's one of the neat things about Fort Smith is that you have people who remember it before. I mean, we've had people who go, I remember coming in here with my dad, that kind of thing when it was Williams Hardware. And of course, also people who remember it as the commissary if you grew up here because, I mean, I don't think of 1979 being all that long ago, but it, it really wasn't. There were lots of people who went to the commissary museum and remember it in the commissary building. And now, of course, it's collective memory of a lot of other people since then. But yeah, that's the story of the museum.
So what is it like being a female executive director and carrying on the legacy of females from our past wanting this and kind of extending that through? What does that mean to you?
It means a great deal, actually. I think because it's a group of women who started this museum, and it's a group of women that you find through the ages, really, who, because they're caring for children, they're working from home, they have some time to volunteer, and so they're before they're in the workforce, that is kind of where their powers are. Is making changes often behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. And so it's a group of women who start this museum. It's a group of women who, through the years in Fort Smith, have been very fundamental to historic renovation, historic preservation, making differences in the city. And something we often don't know about some of those women are their names. Mm-hmm. I can tell you Mrs. George Lyman had a great deal to do with the early museum. I have no idea what her first name was. Now, I think obviously she was very proud to be Mrs. George Lyman. That is how she, that is the name that you see. So I have no doubt that was very much part of her identity, but I have no idea what her first name was. Now, some research can probably find that out, but when you're looking at those initial documents, that's the name that you see. So it's very tied to their husband's identity. But these women were doing such work, like I said, often in the background, that you don't know them. But their work has persevered and has made a difference. And not that I'm caring that people know my name, but it's the same purpose for me, is being able to care for an institution like this. And I'm from the area, grew up here. My mother's family's from here. My grandfather was at one time involved with Fort Smith politics. So there are some things that I know that he did that also means a lot to me, and in being able to carry on. It's just for me personally, a legacy of that sort that just means something to me personally, as far as my family. But yeah, to be, I think I get to focus on areas that maybe hadn't been focused on before. I think because, one, I'm female, but also the world has changed in the last years that have allowed some of that history to be more in the spotlight than it has been in the past. And I think that's very important. Female, women, and minority history completely. So I think it's offered opportunities that maybe hadn't been at least as mainstream as they were at one time now. So this job has given me a lot of professional reward, of course, but there's also a lot of personal meaning to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
I love you.
Yeah. That's amazing. So when you're obviously passionate about preserving history, why is preserving history and doing things like this, exhibiting these artifacts, important for other people?
Well, I think we all know that, if we're doomed to repeat history if we don't know it and things like that. And that is important. But if you don't know your history, you don't know where you came from. All of those things are true, and all of those things are important. But it's important also to make sure that we're covering more history than what you may have learned about in school.
Yeah.
Or particular to the community. Because, for instance, if you look in a textbook, an Arkansas textbook that teaches Arkansas history, Fort Smith gets about 2 paragraphs.
Oh, wow.
And that's, yeah.
Sorry, that just completely blows my mind when you're one of the largest cities.
We should petition that.
Yeah, I was like, I feel like we need to figure this one out.
This should change, yeah.
We get about 2 paragraphs, and we all know, and I know that you're fairly new to the city.
Yeah.
2 paragraphs doesn't begin to even give you an introduction to what Fort Smith is.
It's like not even a scratch.
No, not at all. Not at all. And in defense of that, I'm sure the author, they're covering the entire state. So there's that. But when you think about that is what maybe that's all you learned when you took that class, is this quick little mention of this town on the western border, and that's it. And so our job is to present that so that when you come in here, hopefully you see things that maybe you know about or that are familiar to you, but we're reaching far beyond that and making sure that the history of Fort Smith, because there's 200 years, actually a little more than 200 years now, of history proper. And when I say that, I mean from the establishment of Fort Smith, because until 1842, when you're talking about Fort Smith, you're literally talking about the fort. Yeah. But even before that, there's lots of history before that too that has nothing to do with Fort Smith. So that is technically it's beyond our mission to some degree, but we can still talk about it so that we can introduce it to you. But that's a big part of reaching into the community and making sure that we're touching all those areas, because certainly what you can learn in a book. And you have the books written about Fort Smith too that have a lot of myth in them because they're popular culture. Or
what's one of those? I want to hear one of those. Like, what's a common myth or misconception that you hear?
Well, Judge Parker, Bass Reeves, Belle Starr, there's a lot of common misconceptions there just in general. Now, there are some books written in the 50s whenever the tourism industry, whenever it's realized that tourism can be an industry, you have books written about the area. And they're well researched and they're knowledgeable of the time. That's one of the great things about history, is that the more research is done, the more you can understand and uncover. And sometimes that means that prior history, the knowledge base changes. What you didn't know at one time, you can know. And so, but then some of those books, which were good historical research books, then became popular movies or something.
Yeah.
And so then Hollywood takes liberties, and then that becomes fact. Even when it's really not. I mean, it becomes a cultural understanding of that person or that place or that time, but it's not necessarily true and correct. But because we all grew up in a time where that's where some of the, you think of any cowboy film and there are particular things that come to mind, and maybe that's correct and maybe that's not, but that's where your reference point is. And so you kind of, that's the visual that you come up with whenever you think of those things. And so then it becomes our job to make sure that if the myth, we say this a lot, even among ourselves in the museums, if the myth gets you here, that's okay, but now I have a job and my staff has a job, and as a community, we have a job to help you learn what is different from the myth that you know. Yeah. And some people are real open to that. Some people are not particularly interested in it. It happens, but that's a part of what we run into. Yeah.
And I think history inspires people to maybe not just delve into the history themselves, but maybe to do something differently than they had previously thought because of what had been done in the past. What are some of your favorite exhibits here at the museum? My personal favorite, I love seeing all the stuff about General Darby, but what's your favorite?
Well, I have to say General Darby has become more and more and more important to me, of course. This exhibit that we're sitting in is one of my favorites.
My kids love this one. Yeah.
And again, it's part of it is because the gentleman who worked so hard to develop this, and at the time my job was exhibits, and it was one of the projects that I got to help with. But his passion and his collection over the years has resulted in a very impressive exhibition. And it's also one that, like the Radio Works, the radio station. So when we have school groups, we can play records for them, which they often think are CDs, and they can be on TV. And so it's a very interactive exhibit too, which makes a big difference.
Now, just in case somebody's not watching this and they're just listening to it, where are we? What is this exhibit that we're in right now?
So this exhibit is called On the Air. Okay. And it is the history of radio and television in Fort Smith, beginning in 1922, and works its way up through about 72. Now, you'll see some more recent than 72, but at the time that it was initially developed, that was kind of the stopping point, because you have, radio starts here in 22. Fort Smith has the first television station in the state, Channel 5. Little Rock sometimes wants to dispute that, but they were like a year or two later.
Sorry, Little Rock.
I'm not sorry about that.
So close, but no, Fort Smith gets the gold star on that one. And 72 is when Channel 40 comes on air. So Channel 5 starts in 53. Okay. This was the hub for quite some time. That's cool. And the gentleman, his name was Carl Riggins, and then Jim Ruffley are the two gentlemen who they worked over the years in the sales department and as DJs and engineers. And Carl was a collector. And I really think what happened partially is that when he retired, his wife said, "This has got to go somewhere." Like you have so much, because what you are seeing is his personal collection.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing.
Now, there are things that people have brought to them over the years that have come here, or that once this was set up, they brought here. So there have been some additions, but especially the microphones. Probably 90% of what is in here now is his personal collection, or things that he and Jim collect. Like, for instance, the Channel 5 camera right over there that's behind you. That was found in a van in a field. Somebody knew that they were looking for pieces from Channel 5 and knew that camera was in that van. Yeah. And so they went over there, and the guy that had it said, "Sure, you can take it." And they cleaned it up, and it doesn't work, but it is the original camera at Channel 5. And you can see it. It's in some of the pictures that we have. So there are pieces like that he didn't collect at his home, but that they found later. But so he had a passion for this particular topic, because that was just like I said, they were both DJs. And if you grew up during that time, he was Little CR, and there are people who remember him as Little CR. But that he passed away a couple of years ago.
Oh, man.
But Jim still comes in. Everything in here works. Jim still comes in. He's been an engineer, and so he comes in and makes sure that everything works.
Yeah.
The transmitter that's over there is actually from Poto. It works. And so if you're in the building or right out front of the museum, we can actually play music on a radio, and you can hear it from really here.
And what I love about almost all your exhibits is, there's obviously things that you can't touch. And there's signs that say, please don't touch. But there's also kid-friendly things, things that, kids can interact with or do things.
Absolutely.
I mean, even the booth over here for the television setup, I love that too. And I know that you guys also offer like lots of kids programming and stuff too. So maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So I think the kid-friendly part of it is very important because you go into a museum and basically you see a lot of please do not touch the artifacts.
Right.
And they're great to look at, and I'm one of these people, I'm like, I was in Crystal Bridges and I didn't touch anything, but I was in Crystal Bridges one time and they had a bust of the Marquis de Lafayette. And this is another one of my favorite exhibits that we have here. Downstairs, we have an exhibition or a display really, that has a handwritten letter from the Marquis de Lafayette. It's written in 1825. He writes it coming down the Mississippi on a riverboat. He writes it to Bonneville's mother, actually, General Bonneville, who's a figurehead here in Fort Smith for decades. So you think about that and you think about all that history.
Yeah.
Like, what in the world would we have a letter from Lafayette? But there's this family connection, and he's written it. I mean, it's written in Old French. He's, imagine that. He's on a riverboat, what that atmosphere is and what that experience is, and the letters downstairs. But so I know all this. So I'm in Crystal Bridges, and there's a bust of Lafayette, and it's marble, and all I can think is, I want to touch it so bad because it's cold and it's smooth, and you just want to have that tactile experience. And so for children especially, and or adults who like to touch things, it's
guilty.
Right. And it's hard to go into somewhere and that's all you see are signs that say, look, but don't touch. Yeah. And there's a reason for the don't touch. It's like water that constantly runs through over rocks or whatever. It erodes the artifact. And so that's why the don't touch, because that's what will happen to them and they get broken. So there's a reason for it, but it's very important that kids in all areas have the opportunity to touch and manipulate and experience and feel and those kinds of things. So we try to make in every area in the museum, there's a kid-friendly aspect of it. And sometimes we even have a little coloring station out here, and that doesn't really have much to do with it. It's just kind of a stop that they can make if they want to take a break or rest or just, be occupied while their parents are looking at something. So that's really important, I think. Yeah. And we're trying to develop more of that so that just kids can experience it through their way of experiencing things. And that's kind of where the programs come in. So for school groups or adult groups even, we have this incredible group of volunteers who are reenactors.
Oh, I love this. History is alive. Is that?
Yeah. So, and there's two ways we do that. The school programs, we have reenactors who come in and reenact different periods of Fort Smith history. Now, for instance, if they're in here on the air, they're not necessarily reenactors, but they're people who have lots of experience with this equipment, so they can play the records and they can talk to you about how the equipment works. Otherwise, we have like Judge and Mrs. Parker, and we have a teacher who does education area, and we have a program on the cannon. We have a program about the hardware store. It just depends on what school is wanting what, that kind of thing. Yeah. So, and then the History Alive programs tend to be a couple of times a year, and it's a larger group of reenactors. Yeah. And it's usually an afternoon where you can come in and talk to them. And what's great about our reenactors is that they're not dressed up just or only dressed up in period clothing. They have done their homework. They have researched these people. They know about their time period and depends on what the age group is of the Parkers. So there's a lot of heavy material when the Parkers are doing their program. It depends on the age group. We're not going to talk to second graders the same way we would high schoolers. So the Parkers tend to, for second graders, focus on what are manners of the Victorian era and how would you greet each other and why are we dressed the way we are. And for young girls, the hat pins and what all it took to dress as a woman. But they also might go into the fact that, there were no females on the juries. And why would that be? And it was because they were second-class citizens and not considered a U.S. citizen and weren't property owners, and so they couldn't sit on the jury. And that is an unbelievable fact to young children, boys and girls, because it's just such a foreign concept, and it's kind of like, what is that all about? Why wouldn't you get... So there, you adjust their level of learning as to what you're sharing with them, but we're not going to talk about hangings with children. Now, the one thing that occasionally happens is because there are pictures out there of outlaws and deceased people. We occasionally have a child who will say, well, what is that for? And if they approach it and their teacher kind of gives the go nod, to a certain degree, you can say, something, but we try not to go into details. So, but there's a lot of that. There's some gauging, but more importantly, it's trying to make sure that they're understanding on their level what is happening. And the reenactors are a big part of that because they're, again, a tangible element. They can put a face to the whatever it is that they're learning. They have some interaction. It enhances their comprehension. So yeah, we work a lot towards that.
And I'll say, like, you have young kids. I have a teenage daughter. And, teenagers are notoriously hard to keep happy in general and impress and stuff.
I'm not ready for that.
Yeah, good luck. It'll be great. We'll talk about it. But she loves the gallows and she loves Judge Parker. She wants to be a lawyer. And, so she's gone through and dug a little bit into law that he put into place and how it's impacting
that's
us
cool.
now.
Yeah.
And being able to connect those dots. So even, if you've got visitors that are your visitor or your resident that have teenagers, like, I find that this is a great place for that teenage world to kind of dig into some of these professions and realize that there is this whole history behind it. It's not what you see on TV and stuff like that. Yeah. So you guys do a phenomenal job of that.
Excellent.
And I greatly appreciate you sparking my daughter's imagination and curiosity, really.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm glad to hear
we
that.
came by for the Fall Fest and saw History Alive here, and my kids were enamored by it. So, and I mean, I'm a history nerd, so of course I loved it.
So you just mentioned Fall Fest.
Oh yeah,
and you guys are a part of a lot of big events that you put on, and so it goes beyond just the museum being open and kind of that programming. What other big events do you guys participate in? Why? Why is that important? Kind of give us a little bit, because you've got some fun stuff.
We do. So first of all, part of the mission of that is just like what you said. The museum is the building, and we want you to come in and experience that. But we also, it's outreach, and we need to make sure that the museum is beyond just these walls. And so we go into schools, like we did the reading program the other day. We take programs to schools, but we also develop larger programs so that the community is seeing that. And some of those are what you mentioned, the History Alive. But throughout the year, we do, because it's great to partner with other institutions and organizations in Fort Smith. So Fall Fest is a big one. Fall Fest is in the fall, of course. And it's a way to really get people downtown and come into the building. It's often a free day. Get to experience because we have, even though we've been around since 1910, you would not believe how many times people ask, I've lived here all my life and I've never been into the museum.
Yeah,
it's like,
that kind of blows my mind.
We hear that. So it's a great time to bring people in and just experience downtown and experience Fort Smith. We also do with the Bonneau House and the Clayton House. We do Christmas in July every year. We do Murder Mayhem, and we do the Witches Ride, which is a newer event for us.
What's Murder and Mayhem? Just because it sounds awesome.
Oh, have you never been?
I've never been.
Oh.
I do know what it is somewhat, but I could use a refresher, I guess.
So Murder Mayhem, it started out initially on trolley rides, and it was the haunted history of Fort Smith. But it was also the torrid and the crazy and the disturbing and all that. So we told more stories than ghost stories. And over the years, it's become a progressive dinner. And so you come to the museum for drinks and hors d'oeuvres, and we do ghost tours. We're here for about an hour. And then we have a hayride, because we had to make it a hayride during COVID to keep it going, so that people were breathing fresh air. And from there, you go over to the Bonneville House, where there's a full dinner and some more ghost stories. And then you walk the Belle Grove Historic District, and we talk about the homes and the ghost stories associated with those homes. And sometimes, because we're outdoor and we're walking, it's usually small groups, ends up being a lot of conversation about the architecture of Belle Grove, which is incredible. There's so many different types of architecture. And then we end at the Clayton House with drinks and s'mores and a tour of the Clayton House with more ghost stories. It's an incredible event, and it ends up being like a 3 or 4 hour event by the time it's all. We start about 5:30, and it's often 9:30, 10 o'clock before we.
That's cool.
And that's the event, though, that people get to be up on floors that are not always open.
Yep.
Like they get, that's
cool.
3rd and 4th, right?
Yep.
Which is, to me, is like absolutely incredible that you kind of get this back of the house tour. And I'm a nerd on things like that.
Yeah. Well, and that's where, because 3rd and 4th are where we house our collection. And so they're not publicly accessible. And so probably 10% of what we house is on display. The rest of it's upstairs.
Wow. And you do rotate things, I guess, then? Or okay.
Yeah, we rotate things, but still we have such an extraordinarily large collection because we've been around for so long.
Yeah.
That the majority of it is upstairs. And
cool.
So that back of the house, you get to see, all of, some people are just, all of the archival boxes. I mean, what's the method of preservation, or some of it's, we kind of joke about, if we have one steam trunk, we've got 50, if we've got one typewriter, we've got 50 because technology changes and people don't want to throw it away, but they've gotten the newest edition. And, so there's a lot of that too, but it's a collaborative event, and a lot of fun. And then of course, last year we started the Darby Challenge.
Yeah.
So that's our newest big project. All of these are just whatever the era or the time, are tied to the history of Fort Smith. So it's a way to bring that to the public in a different light than a traditional in-house visit.
Which the Darby Challenge, it's a sister city event, right? So explain, I know you're super involved with sister cities. What is a sister city? Why are we in sister city relationships? And you've been really from the beginning helped maintain those relationships, right? Is that correct? Or
somewhat. It's kind of something that I very luckily, fortunately, was able to go to Cisterna, and I used to say Cisterna because that's the way it looks.
I still do. Cisterna.
Cisterna. It's actually Cisterna. I went in 21. Mayor Sanders so our relationship with Cisterna started in 1984. So we celebrated 40 years last fall. And the city had been part of that, and the Darby House and Mr. Emery Dockery at the time. And he kept it going even when the city at one time wasn't involved. And then Mayor Sanders had wanted to bring it back to the city being more involved. So he had organized a trip, and it was supposed to happen in the spring of 2020. Oh. And so that ceased. And so in 21, just 3 of us had the opportunity to go. And that just sparked and reignited everything.
Yeah.
And out of that has come, really the folks in these cities are, there is a true friendship there. So sister cities, in the 80s, there was a big push for domestic cities to twin with international cities. So lots of cities have sister cities. That's not unusual. Fort Smith, in the way that Fort Smith is unusual because they do things like this, ours is very tied to the history between and behind these cities.
Yeah, and that's not common.
No. No. And so what that is General Darby. So in 84, it was the 30th anniversary, I believe, of the Battle of Cisterna. And there were a group of Rangers who had gone over, who had been making pilgrimages to Cisterna anyway. And there was a mayor there at the time, Johnny Salas, who thought it would be a really good idea to twin with Fort Smith. And the purpose of Sister Cities is a goodwill mission. It's also to encourage and enhance peaceful exchanges. But there are also, I mean, there's a mission statement in a sister city that to promote cultural, historical, educational, trade, technical. Now it would be technology, but and economic impact between these two cities. So over the years, I think it has been very much a goodwill relationship with some student exchanges that have been very popular. We're really working towards that expansion of sister cities, making it have an economic impact for us, all of us, to work more towards programs and projects and initiatives that bring them here, us go there and do these true exchanges of historical or cultural or technological business, things like that. So we have a lot of things in the works that we brought back. But that's the purpose of a sister city. Our history is, again, General Darby. So kind of in a nutshell, because there's a lot of it there, the Rangers, and they're called Darby's Rangers during World War II, they were tasked with, Rome had been captured by the Nazis. Cisterna had been captured by the Nazis. And so the Allies' job, and the Rangers at that point, they had been formed in 42, so this is 2 years into the war. They had had a very successful campaign through Africa and up into Italy, and had become known for night missions. They had trained exclusively for that. And so they had a mission to advance to Cisterna and this entire mission that flanked the city and all this. What they didn't know is that the Germans had counterintelligence. And so they laid in wait for them and ambushed them. And in Cisterna at the time, outside of Cisterna, it was all swampland. And so these American Rangers are moving across vast fields of swampland that is open. There's no protection. It's cold. It's January of 1944. They're slushing through this marshland. So they're kind of sitting ducks. And I never remember this exact number, 764, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Very exact.
Something like that. Well, it's probably 20 on either given side. But they, when they're ambushed, it just wipes out the 1st, the 3rd, and the 4th battalions. And there are reportedly six of them who returned to base camp that night. The rest of the Rangers are taken out as either killed in action or POWs. And so it's that sacrifice. And Darby's the commander at the time. He's a little bit off-site in another area. He's typically with the units. That one, he just happened to, his orders were to stay in a different place because he fought alongside them, in command of them, but alongside them. And so it's that sacrifice of those Rangers and him as their commander that sister city relationship honors. And so even though they were not able to liberate them, it is the beginning of a 4-month liberation that happens. And after 4 months, it is liberated. But in the meantime, these citizens of Cisterna moved to the tunnels underground. The tunnels their city is old enough. It's actually mentioned in the Bible. It's called Trace Taverns in the Bible, and they had a ruling family. So there's a palace in town, in the city center, and they have these, I don't know if they were escape routes or just private passageways, but these massive tunnel system underground that you can stand in. I mean, even taller than that, but some of them may be about this height. And the citizenship moves into the tunnels and lives there for 4 months. And it's mostly women and children or men who for some reason cannot fight. And there are things like for them to go above ground because there's a cistern in the center of this palace to go out to draw water or anything. There are snipers up there, and it's a perilous 4 months for them. And it destroys their city. At one point, Germany is bombing them, and then America is bombing them because they're trying to oust the Germans. And it's an ancient city that sustains a lot of damage. And even now, when you go over there, there is very definitely, when you see some of their ceremony, there is life before World War II, there is what happened during World War II, and then there is life after. And that life after, there is a particular DNA, some sort of imprint, something that is passed down to the people who are like us, generations removed from World War II, but they still there is something that they carry with them that they are very knowledgeable of and understand what happened during World War II, and they don't want to ever relive that, and their citizenship knows that, and they talk about it, and they do plays about it, and they share that information with you. And so the sacrifices of the Rangers and of Darby are part of that.
Yeah.
And so that's where that tie comes from. Our second sister city in Nago Torbole, which is a brand new sister city to us, that was in 2023. And that one I had very lucky to have a lot of involvement in making happen, myself along with some other people in town and the city. And very unexpected, but Nago Torbole is where General Darby is killed in action. So he was with the 10th Mountain at that time. He was assistant commander, and he had gone back to Italy after Cisterna. He had been home and then been to the Pentagon, and some things had happened, and he had gone back. And April 30th, 2 days before the war is declared over, he is killed in action. He had stepped in for an officer who had not felt well and had taken his place, and there were some rogue 88 millimeter shells being fired by the German army, and one of them landed near him and a group of officers and exploded, and he took shrapnel to the heart, and he was killed in action. And that happened right at the end of the war. And so they honor him. And what is so incredibly, I find, even the sister cities are tied, because when he was killed in action, his body was kept in Italy for 4 years. I initially thought that it went back to Cisterna. There is some debate as to whether it was quite in Cisterna or not, but it's neither really here nor there. They cared for him. They cared for his remains in Italy for 4 years. And then he's brought home. And then if you go to either of these towns and say you're from Fort Smith, their eyes light up. They know this history. They know that it means something, even if they're like us, like they're not entirely clear on maybe what all the history is. Yeah. They still know that there's something there. And so Cisterna, the stone, if you go to Nago Torbole, there is in the city center, there's a monument there to Darby. And that stone comes from Cisterna. So Cisterna worked to make sure that there was stone from their city that is in Cisterna. And when we went to Twin, Cisterna came up, representation from their leadership came up, and just a show of, of support for that. And so they're very tied. And when we went over for the 40th celebrations, Nago Torbole, some of their leadership came down. And there are film projects, and there's lots of work going on. But so even they are very supportive of one another. And so it has truly, and I mean this honestly, it has truly become this giant global friendship.
Yeah.
That, and I think that was already in place from the work that people before us had done. It was a little quieter a few years prior. In the last few years, we've been really able to educate people about it and bring more people in and work towards it being a bigger part of Fort Smith history.
Yeah, and Mr. Salas and several others visited recently to honor the 40-year anniversary of twinning with them.
Yep.
So that's awesome.
Yep.
So, and I just want to reiterate one thing. So General Darby is the founder of today's Army Rangers.
There's, again, from a historian standpoint, you run into some, you
myth that one.
Did I just myth that?
No.
Okay.
So the curious thing about the Rangers, so every war that America has been in, there's essentially been a Ranger unit, but it has not continued after the war. So in World War II, the British Commandos had a unit, and the U.S. wanted to model a Ranger unit after the U.S. the British Commandos. And so they chose General Darby to be the commander, and then he helped vet and had a lot of influence on the first 500 soldiers that became what was then called Darby's Rangers. So the U.S. Army that we have now, or Army Rangers, is a continuation of what began with Darby. And then, he's taught in Ranger School. There are numerous things named after him across the U.S. We get Rangers here that come visit because we have just a room, an exhibit hall about him. And it took me a minute for a while because I kept thinking, okay, as much as this is an incredible piece of history, but you know how you read somebody was born somewhere, and so that hometown kind of claims them. Maybe they moved when they were 3 and didn't. Well, what I have found in recent years is that truly, so Darby grew up here, graduated when it was Fort Smith High School, and he goes on to West Point. But once he leaves here, he actually does not really come back except for a few visits because he's in the Army and he's being moved everywhere. But it is very much, his family's been involved in researching this and helping us understand. It is truly his upbringing here, the sense of community, the values that his parents instilled in him, the closeness of the community, the things he was involved in that helped him develop as a person. It is those things that he carries on that develop his leadership styles. And his leadership styles are studied. That's part of what they do at Ranger School. And so it is his development as a person from Fort Smith and as a child of the community and as a family in this town that led him to become, and he kept those foundations. You can read about it. That's what's so great about him, is that it's contemporary enough history that we have just lots of resource material. We have some of his essays that he wrote. He's very clever. But he carries that with him, and you can see that. And so it's his formation in Fort Smith, in this town, that creates the man that he becomes, and therefore the impact that he ends up having globally. He is the only general. When he was killed in action, he was a colonel. And so if you go to Torbole, their Ranger Challenge is called the 40-mile Colonel Darby Ranger Challenge. We call ours General Darby because we know him as General. He's the only general to be awarded the title of general posthumously.
Oh, cool.
Period. That speaks.
Yeah,
it does. And you can read the accolades from Patton and Rommel, and it just goes on. And he was only 34 when he died.
Oh wow.
What he could have done and come back and been involved with, of course, we'll never know. But 80 years long, that legacy still impacts generations of people. Last year at the Darby Challenge, there was a woman from Nebraska or Minnesota. Her father had been an original 500, and she made the trip for the weekend just because it was a Darby event. She didn't participate in it, actually. She just came to spend the weekend in a place that he was being honored because her father, I think it would have meant a lot to her father, and she wanted to honor her father in that way. And that's the kind of thing that you find. There's so many people who don't actually remember him. I mean, I had the honor of meeting one original ranger when the statue came to town in 2016. We had a reception here, and his name was, I don't know what his given name was. He went by Punch. And it was the most amazing thing. He came, there were a lot of us in the Darby room, and before he enters, you kind of feel the room go quiet and people just kind of move to the side, and they just kind of part for him to come in. And I'm sure the people that were with him knew who he was and knew that sort of respect needed to be there. But I didn't know, and I kind of thought, what is going on, And when he came in, and of course you're thinking about that, and 80 years long, that there is still that much devotion and dedication to the impact that this one man had. And so that's the kind of thing that we want people to understand. And so the long answer to your question was yes, those are why we do programming outside of the museum, because Fort Smith, I love this town. Like I said, I grew up here. We through no fault of our own, mind you, the historical districts, we get very focused on Judge Parker, and rightfully so. But a lot of that is popular culture and all kinds of other things. That was a 20-year span of history, very significant history. But Fort Smith has 200 years of history, and Darby is a part of that. But there's there's just so much to talk about here, and so developing in-house programs, outreach programs in schools, or programming outside of the walls helps people to understand what that is about, because there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
I think it is important. I love that there's a connection, and it's, you come into a city like this as a newbie, and you're like, I didn't know much about Fort Smith. Yeah. And the more I dig in and the more I talk, I'm like, there's so much around the world that Fort Smith has its handprint and its thumbprint on in some way. And I think, again, I always say this, residents don't realize how great, how influential, how all these things, but our visitors are flocking here.
Yeah.
Yep.
And people are coming here because of things that happened. People that came out of the city, people that just have had this monumental impact. And it's what I love about this city is there's a bunch of places I've been where it's like, okay, maybe something, but like truly it's so deeply rooted in everything. As again, just as I continue to dig in, I'm like, holy cow, I didn't know that either. And that's another thing. And so it's very cool.
It goes on, and it's really true about that. I've had visitors come in, and one lady said to me one time, there's just so much history here, and you hear that a lot, and all of a sudden it kind of dawned on me. I thought, all cities have history.
Yeah.
But if you don't have people working and it doesn't have to be just history, tourism or cultural institutions, whatever that may be, if you don't have people working to give that back, then you don't know it. And so, you might go to somewhere that it's like, well, this is cool, but nobody really knows anything, or we can't find anything. But so you have to have those people and those organizations and institutions working to make sure that when you come to town that that, because we've got ambassadors from Fort Smith. Snoop Dogg credits Rudy Ray Moore for modern rap. Rudy Ray Moore grew up here. And
you got Snoop Dogg.
There's just, it really, when you start looking at that, there's also. Basketball player. You name it, it goes on. And I think growing up here and everybody's got a different experience, but where you grow up impacts what you do and how you do it and who you become. And, so that strength of community makes a difference in what you see later on.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll put a link to the Fort Smith Museum of History website in the show notes and on our posts, just to make sure people can access all the information, know what your hours are, how to plan a visit here if they want to visit here. But thank you again, not just for being on today's episode, but also for allowing us to film in here.
Oh, absolutely.
Today as well.
Glad to have y'all very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.